Hello. Today we are going to be talking about Elizabeth Peratrovich Day and why we celebrate it. In 2023, this became a national holiday, but the state of Alaska has honored it since 1988. So, who was Elizabeth Peratrovich? Elizabeth Peratrovich was born on July 4th, 1911, to the Raven moiety of the Tlingit peoples in southeast Alaska. She was orphaned and adopted at a young age. At birth, she was given a Tlingit name, and I am not a Tlingit speaker, but I have done some research and reached out to a professor through the University of Alaska Southeast, who did give me some guidance. To the best of my ability, her indigenous name would have been pronounced Kakshulgot. I could be mispronouncing that. That is my best attempt at it after my research. But when she was adopted, she was renamed to Elizabeth. She grew up in southeast Alaska. She went to college in Washington and then returned home to Klawak, Alaska after marrying her husband, Roy Peratrovich, who was also Tlingit. Eventually, they did relocate to Juneau, and that is where her legend as a civil rights activist began. The United States did not see any widespread anti-discrimination acts until the 60s, but Alaska passed the very first one in the United States in 1945. Elizabeth Peratrovich was instrumental in this passing. And until the Alaska Equal Rights Act of 1945 was passed, the indigenous population of Alaska was heavily discriminated against, and they were segregated from the ever-growing white population. This is the era that Elizabeth and many other indigenous peoples were raised in. Before the Anti-Discrimination Act was passed, it was common for shops to display signs that included such discriminatory phrases as "no dogs, no natives," and "we cater to white trade only." On this slide, you will see a picture of Governor Gruning, and next to him is Elizabeth Peratrovich. This was 1945 when the Alaska Equal Rights Act was signed into law. In Juneau 1941, Elizabeth and her husband are both leaders of respective indigenous civil rights groups. Roy was in the Alaska Native Brotherhood, and Elizabeth was in the Alaska Native Sisterhood. One day, around the start of World War II, they were out walking and they spotted a "No Natives Allowed" sign at a local inn. They wrote to Governor Gruning, the same Gruning for which the Liberal Arts Building is named for at UAF, expressing their anger. They pointed out that the indigenous people who were not allowed in this inn were just as willing and able to lay down their lives in the war as the white people that they were willing to serve. They felt that this was unfair and discriminatory, which it was. This event is what sparked a campaign with Governor Gruning to end segregation and discrimination. When the Anti-Discrimination Act first went to the House in 1943, it failed, but this did not stop Elizabeth and her husband. In fact, they continued to campaign, traveling around Alaska to gather more indigenous support. In 1945, it went up for vote a second time. In 1945, the anti-discrimination bill passed in the House, and it moved on to the Senate, where it had the votes, but it faced a long discussion full of hateful opposition. Far from being brought closer together, which will result from this bill, Senator Alan Shattuck began, the races should be kept further apart. Who are these people, barely out of savagery, who want to associate with us whites with 5,000 years of recorded civilization behind us? And Elizabeth sat there, knitting and listening to the leaders of her country discuss how savage her people were. She, Tlingit woman in a room full of white men stood and spoke. I would not have expected that I, who am barely out of savagery, would have to remind gentlemen with 5,000 years of recorded civilization behind them of our Bill of Rights. Her words, thrown back in the face of the senator who disrespected her people, solidified the first anti-discrimination bill passed in the United States, signed into law on February 16, 1945. Her words were met with wide applause from the audience. Elizabeth passed away on December 1st, 1958, and 30 years later, the Alaska legislature established a state holiday honoring Elizabeth Petratrovich's activist work. February 16th, the anniversary of the signing of the Alaska Equal Rights Act. And in 2023, February 16th was recognized as a national holiday in her honor. This is not the only example of how we honor Elizabeth Peratrovich. In 2020, 75 years after the Alaska Equal Rights Act was signed into law, the U.S. Mint released 5 million coins in her honor, depicting her portrait and the symbol of her moiety, the raven. In 2020, Google did one of their doodles honoring Elizabeth Peratrovich. And this is a mural of Elizabeth Peratrovich displayed on the downtown Juneau Library. This was completed in 2021. COVID slowed it down. This was supposed to also be a 2020 unveiling, but it's a beautiful piece of art. Thank you for listening. If you would like to know more, this is where I gathered my information.